The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
I think great literature is not safe. I would encourage you to read the book. It's very beautiful. It's very powerful. And it's not safe. It's not safe literature. It will draw you in. And it will expose the deepest human experiences, including the beauty of the grace at the ending.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Songs for the Silent Passage is a collection of essays exploring Walt Wangren Jr.'s body of literary work. The essays were written by his friends and colleagues at the Chrysostom Society, including Eugene Peterson, Lucy Shaw, John Wilson, and Philip Yancey. The book was recently published by Rabbit Room Press. It was edited by Matthew Dickerson and Ann Doe Overstreet. Matthew Dickerson is my guest for this episode of the Habit Podcast. He's a computer science professor at Middlebury College in Vermont, but he also teaches literature and creative writing, besides being a novelist. All right, Matthew Dickerson, thank you so much for making time to be on the Habit Podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So you are one of the editors. You and Ann Doe Overstreet edited Songs from the Silent Passage, kind of a volume of essays honoring Walt Wangren. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the goal was really to explore the literature, to explore Walt Wangren's literature, more than just to honor him. Although I hope the book does it. I think his body of literature is so extensive and so worthwhile that we really hope the book brings some attention and some deeper understanding and deeper appreciation of that work.
Tell me how this book came to be, and how you got the job of being the editor of this book.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's been quite a while in the works. I think probably the seed for this project came 7 or 8 years ago. I'm a member of a group of writers called the Chrysostom Society. And Walt Wangren was one of the founders of that group, but because of his cancer, he had not been active during the 10 years that I have been a member of the group. He's only been able to come once in my 10 years. But the one of the things we've done as a group is co-written a few books, and I think we had a couple come out, and we were looking at potential projects that we could collaborate on. And I just suggested this project. I thought it would be a nice collaborative project because the breadth of Walt Wangren's writings, pastoral literature and fiction of a variety of different genres, modern novels and medieval heroic epics and myth and fairy tale and poetry and children's literature, that a collection of essays exploring some of these different aspects of his writing would be a great collaborative project for a broad group of writers like the Dickerson Society. So I suggested it, and there was enough interest to begin to pursue it.
By the way, the Chrysostom Society, do y'all like meet once a year? What does that organization even look like?
We have one gathering per year where the in person, assuming there are no pandemics going on at the time, we would gather for a 4-day weekend every year just to be in person. But then there's frequently other informal times over the course of the year when subgroups might meet, or different ones of us will be participating in the same event or same conference. I've visited many other members of the society. I've run writing conferences and had them come up as guests. But yes, we meet once a year for about 4 days. We will have times of just sharing our lives with each other, just being open, vulnerable and real. Times of, I would describe it as encouragement, times of collaboration, and also opportunities just to share what we're currently working on or have currently completed with one another. And you can seek feedback if you want.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad y'all have that.
It's been very significant and encouraging and challenging for me as a writer to meet with this group of people. All writers of Christian faith, of a variety of different backgrounds.
Yeah, it's a great group of writers, and many of whom contributed to this collection. How many contributors were there to this collection?
Well, if you count the foreword and the afterword, we had 8 contributions, 8 chapters.
Well, in your essay, Matthew, you talk about the idea that as writers, we often tell the same story over and over again, and so I'd like to hear you talk about what is the story that Walt Wangerin was telling over and over again.
I when I say that, I don't say that in a dismissive way. I'm not trying to reduce his literature. I actually, that expression came from a favorite songwriter of mine, Mark Hurd, the late Mark Hurd. I think he passed away almost 30 years ago. And he was saying to a friend of his once, I just write the same song over and over again, which is an oversimplification, but there are certain themes that do appear frequently in his songs, and he explores them with different characters and different imagery, but it's the same theme. And I think there's certain themes that do reappear frequently in Walt Wangerin's writings. And there's the one that I explored in my chapter. There's really 3 different stories, one told as a sort of fairy tale myth, one story told as a medieval legend, and one told as a mix of a modern novel interwoven with the Greek myth. In those three books, his novel of St. Julian, his the Book of Sorrows, and the Orphean Passages. And I think those 3, there really is a common theme, not just a common theme, almost a common story that he retells in 3 different ways. And it is, it's a story ultimately about grace, but it is also a story about how sometimes before we are able to understand or accept grace, sometimes we have to go through times of what Wangerin calls a silent passage, a time when we're not aware of God. We don't hear God. We don't think God is present. We don't think we're experiencing God. We feel abandoned. Maybe that's part of it. I think also part of it, and these go hand in hand, is this maybe desperate need or desperate attempt to earn grace or to be worthy of grace, which of course we can't be. We can't earn it. We can't by nature by definition, we can't be worthy of grace. It wouldn't be grace if we had earned it.
Yeah.
And so all three of these stories are in some ways tales of characters who desperately want to be worthy of love and grace and recognize they're not, and also go through times where they just don't think God is listening to them, or God is there, or God is present. God's not answering their prayers the way that they want God to.
Yeah. As you're saying that, I'm trying to make some connections. I think you might be able to help. The idea of a character earning, proving their worth or earning favor, that's a way to structure a story, right?
Sure.
And it is you think about stories that are focused on a hero's glory, for instance. That's a viable way, an engaging way to tell a story. And then there are stories of grace, which I think it's a little harder to tell those stories in ways that are compelling. That to say that it's harder, that may or may not be true, but maybe we can talk about that too. And then there is the way you talk about Wangren stories. They go so dark before, or they often go so dark before the grace. At
least
a lot of people have the stomach for it.
At least the three stories that I just spoke about, St. Julian and the Book of Sorrows and the Orphan passages.
And I think you can add the Book of the Dun Count to that list too.
In a different way, I think there's some slightly different character arcs in that as well.
But it still gets
I don't
dark
think
in there.
Yeah, I don't think Chanticleer goes through the same thing in the Dun Cow that he goes through in the Book of Sorrows. But yes, there is an element in the Dun Cow story as well. But in those three, yes, what you said is absolutely correct. There is just the darkest of times of I would use the word sorrow, just deep sorrow and loss. And it is in or out of that deepest loss that there's an understanding of how deep grace is, and an understanding of how impossible it is to earn or to be worthy of, and how wonderful it is then when we do receive it. But you don't get there quickly. You don't get to that. You don't get to that moment of grace easily. I think it'd be like if the whole gospel the whole gospel story took place in Peter's life between the denial and the resurrection. If you expanded that outward. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Not the resurrection, but the restoration. It's even more. It's like, from Peter's denial, not just to the resurrection of Jesus, but to when he really feels restored to that relationship with Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In terms of that darkness, which is then redeemed by grace, I was thinking about Wangren's 5 rules for 5 covenants for Christian writers that he gave to his creative writing students, and the first one was
which Jim Scopp explores in his chapter in our book.
Yeah,
he explores those.
Yeah, right. That's right. That's how I know the 5 rules. I just didn't know them off the top of my head. But general reality. I promise to be true to what I see around me, to what I know by my own faculties, my sense perceptions, my experience, my sense of truth, to be the world as we know it. I wonder if I might have had a typo in there somewhere. Anyway, but the idea that commitment to see what we actually see and not what we're supposed to see, I think is so important to good storytelling, and I think that's such a big part of how Wangren tells his stories, because as a pastor, as a parent, there's so many ways that he's been in the trenches with people, and seeing grace come out of that, but not always. It's not always easy to see.
No, but the term trenches, right, is accurate. I mean, there is a lot of time that a lot of us spend in those trenches, and if you really follow through on that metaphor and you think of the soldiers in the trenches in war, they don't have the bird's eye view. They don't have the general's view.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily see anything good that's coming out of their being in that trench.
Mm-hmm.
They don't see the picture of the whole line of the front. They don't see what they're defending. They just see the mud and the refuse in the trench with them. I think.
Did you see the movie Dunkirk? Did you see the movie Dunkirk?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, that's one of those movies that is so close in on the soldier's point of view that Dunkirk's such a great story when you see it from a distance. When you get some critical distance from it, it's such a wonderful story. And in this movie, you see what it's like to be the soldier, and it's not especially glamorous or exciting.
I just rewatched the Tolkien biopic, a lot of which takes place in the Battle of Somme with Tolkien in the trenches. So that imagery was still fresh.
Yeah.
Your first one of those, of those 5 principles for the writer, it makes me think of an old comic strip that we still joke about often in my family. I don't even remember where I first saw it, but it's sort of a little poking fun at the way Sunday school often happens. And people are looking at a picture and the Sunday school teacher says, well, what do you see in the picture? Little Tommy. And he says, well, it looks like a squirrel, but I'll say Jesus.
Yeah.
And right, we give you this answer that we think is this spiritual or correct or appropriate answer, and in some ways the translation of that first principle is if what you see is a squirrel, describe the squirrel.
Yeah.
Don't try to turn that squirrel into this rosy picture of Jesus. And if what you see is a world full of pain and suffering and loss, that's what you describe, and that's the true scene that you're giving.
Yeah. So speaking of sort of dark stories, in your essay you described this. You said it took you more than a year to write your chapter of this book, and part of that delay came from your unwillingness, if that's the right word, to re-engage with St. Julian. Right?
No, that's the right word, definitely.
A difficult book. And you said, I like the way you put it. You said the reason you didn't want to engage with it was largely because it was so beautifully told.
Right. Yeah.
Right? It is so fully engaging that it's really painful to
a poorly told story, a poorly written story, a poorly captured character is not going to move me so deeply. I'll be sitting on the outside just looking at a badly painted picture and never really so fully drawn into the depth of the emotion of the character. But because it's so beautifully written and so beautifully told, it packs a tremendous amount of emotional power. There are a few stories that are like that for me. Really, really beautiful and moving, but which I know if I go back to reread, it's going to take a lot of emotional energy. I think passages from Norman Maclean's A River Runs Through It do that for me. There's a scene, I've been teaching Tolkien's writing for 30 plus years. And in fact, tomorrow is my last class this semester on a Tolkien class I've just been teaching. And in 30 years, there's one scene, one passage I almost never teach because it's so moving. And I don't go, as beautiful as I think the Silmarillion is, I don't often go back. I know it's going to take me a certain emotional energy to reread this particular passage, this particular chapter of it, because it's so beautifully told, but also so deeply sorrowful. And so I knew I'm going to have to enter into with a certain amount of emotional energy to reread Julian and to try to understand it and write about it with authenticity. And so there was a resistance to going back in and re-entering that story to write this chapter.
Well, I started thinking about when you were talking about what you were just talking about, sort of thinking about roller coasters and the idea that I get this thrill, I get to be afraid when I really know I'm okay, right? The roller coaster is not really going to go off the rails. No. It just sort of feels like it is, And I mean, I know sometimes roller coasters come off the rails, but not very often. And so, I have this, it's this safe way to feel that thrill. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like maybe you're talking about a kind of story, and I think maybe a slasher film is another one of those. I get to sort of, I don't watch a lot of slasher films, but I think the idea is I get the thrill of that kind of danger without really entering, as you said, but I'm not really entering into it because it's not really beautiful,
right?
And it sounds like you're saying a book like St. Julian, you are entering into that. In a way that's not as safe as a roller coaster.
No, I think great literature is not safe. And when I say this, no one should think that I'm trying to discourage you from reading the book. I would encourage you to read the book. It's very beautiful. It's very powerful.
It is beautiful.
And it's not safe. Uh-huh. It's not safe literature. It will draw you in. And it will expose, I think, the deepest human experiences, including the beauty of the grace at the ending.
Right.
The beauty of the restoration, the beauty of the way that Julian experiences grace. And it's through the story. It's throughout the story he experiences grace from his parents, from his wife. There's grace throughout it in really beautiful, powerful ways. But he's unable to accept that because he doesn't feel worthy of it until the very end.
Yeah.
So I highly recommend the story because it's not safe. But you don't go and sit and reread it every 3 weeks or every 5 weeks.
Yeah. I agree. It is a beautiful, beautiful book, and I haven't had the courage to go back into it. If I had known what I was getting into when I first read it, 10, 15 years ago, I might not have done it. But again, it sounds like we are unrecommending that book. We are recommending that.
We are recommending it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this maybe is a nice lead in to what is it Tom Scott? That am I saying is
James Scott? Yeah.
James Scott. Yeah. Sorry. And he talks about this idea of singing and preaching as being two different things, and that somehow Wangren manages to sing as he preaches and preaches these things. And he says, traditionally, there's something about art that won't hug a pulpit. I love that, that sentence. Art suggests, it entices, it begs our participation in process. Preaching clarifies the straight and narrow. Art shows us a world. Preaching shows us the way. Art asks us the questions that, grandly enough, have no clear answers, and takes great joy in doing just that. Sermons answer those questions. Art wonders. Sermons try not to. He's coming down pretty hard on sermons. It sounds like in that passage.
I don't think that it's a critique of sermons. What it is a critique of artists who try to turn art into sermons.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the problem is. If you confuse them, here's the way when I'm teaching creative writing, the way I would express something similar to that. I would, particularly if I'm teaching creative writing in a context of maybe a Christian conference where I think the writers are more inclined to want to preach, because I teach at a lot of non-religious or secular venues as well. But I think in that religious context, there's more of a temptation to preach. What I tell those in my workshops is, if you really have a sermon you really want to preach, don't write the story. Yeah. Get the sermon out of the way, and then come back and write the story. Because in the story, the characters, the setting, the plot really has to move it. It can't just be a thinly veiled sermon. Yeah. And so I think some of the power of Wangren is that it really is deeply moving and deeply theological, and deep, profound themes in it. but they're never coming at you in abstractions. They're not coming at you in moral, in just principles. They're all incarnate. They're all embedded in real flesh and real blood and real people that you care about, which is why they're so moving.
Right.
The
question is never, do you assent to this proposition?
Yes.
But rather, can you experience this scene that I'm presenting?
Exactly. I could sit and have a conversation with you about, abstractly about grace and suffering, and it's not going to choke me up. But if we sit and really, if you force me in this interview to sit and read some of the passages from either any of those three books, or from the Book of the Dun Cow, or the passage in the Silmarillion I was just talking about, or certain passages in A River Runs Through It, all of a sudden I wouldn't be able to have the conversation with you with this abstract, unemotional, intellectual disagreement or agreement. I would point out, by the way, that Jesus' teaching is so often in the form of stories. That's more like singing and less like preaching. The parables, Jesus's parables are, bottomless pits, or not bottomless pit, bottomless wells, not a bottomless pit. That's very, a bottomless well of nourishment that you can keep going back to again and again and approach in so many different ways, because they are incarnate stories. Yeah. And Wangren, I think Wangren's like that. His stories are real and true and powerful, and yet, really deep.
Mm-hmm. Which, as I always say to Christian people who are writers, if you believe that the world is shot through with meaning, you don't have to add meaning to it. It's not your job to make meaning, to insert meaning. But you're safe. We just about, we were just being down on safety a minute ago, but it is, let's just borrow that word. You're safe to tell the truth about what you've actually seen in the world.
Yep.
If the world really is meaningful.
That's right. We don't have to be afraid to speak the truth of what we see.
Yeah. And that doesn't in any way negate the grace that you're ultimately hoping to illustrate. Of course it doesn't negate. This broken world is the only place that grace does its work. And so there we go. Well, I was really interested in you. Philip Yancey wrote that lovely afterword to the book. There were about 10 things in his afterword I wanted to talk about, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to direct our conversation toward the question of precision in writing, and that Wangren has always resisted precision. He says, and this is Yancey quoting a letter from Wangren. "Precision has become nearly morality," he wrote me, referring to the precisions of objective observation, analytic theologies, intellectual persuasions. He sought instead to draw the reader into another world, a suspension of disbelief, carried more by music and lyricism than by sense and reason. And I love this. A writer, this is quoting Wangren again, "A writer hopes for the obedience of a good reader who says, 'I will enter this world a while, however different it is from my own more familiar expressions of truth.'" But I was, I can't decide what to think and feel about the things he's saying about precision, because I value precision.
Sure.
And when I teach writing, I try to get people to be precise. Yeah. And one of my frustrations, I love Wangren, but I do get a little frustrated with his imprecision sometimes. And so the floor is open for discussion.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of it either. I think there's different ways you could see this. There is a sort of a mathematical precision in a formula.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And, in a mathematical formula, the goal is there's only one way to interpret it. I do teach in addition to teaching literature courses and writing courses, I actually also have a PhD in computer science, and I teach a lot of computer science classes. I'm currently teaching a Tolkien class, and I'm currently teaching a computer science class. And one of the things I have my students do is describe things in natural language, but then give it in the formal, and I say precise, language of mathematics. And the idea is it's unambiguous. There's no room for interpreting it in different ways. We want to, as much as possible, get rid of the ambiguity, and I don't think art works. I don't think art is intended to work that way. I'm not saying that art doesn't have meaning, but I think among other things, it should have many levels or many layers of meaning. And that it has, in some sense, not just the ability to mean something to us, to mean something, but it has the ability to mean something to us. You know, can
you say more about that? Say about one more sentence about that.
There's a couple different questions that you can ask about literature. You know, is not only what does it mean, but what does it mean to you? What does it mean today? What does it mean in this culture? So again, I'm not trying to say that meaning of words is entirely subjective, but that there is both in what you might think of as an objective meaning, but also a lot of freedom to enter into it with our imaginations, to apply it in different ways, to be moved in different ways. The same story, without changing its meaning, might mean might move you in very different, equally true ways than it moves me. And it might move me in a different way 6 months from now or 3 years from now than it did 6 years ago or 3 months ago. And I think something like the goal of mathematical precision is to remove that element. So that's what I think, and that's what I wonder if what they're getting at is there. You know, again, I think the passage you just read mentions an impressionist drawing. Right. And you can enter into an impressionist drawing with your imagination in a certain way, seeing some things that aren't there. Or seeing some things that are there. It's not even that you're seeing things that aren't there as much as your mind is filling in what's there, but not what is not explicit. And so there's room that I think that approach leaves room for the reader to enter into the story with his or her own experience, his or her own imagination, and apply it or to his or her own life. In new ways.
And it takes so for a writer who's interested in conveying truth, if that's the right way to put it, that's a risk, right?
Yes.
To open up your work to a reader's interpretation, understanding, subjective experience. That's a risk that you take as a writer if you are trying to convey a message, whatever. But it's also the only way to convey anything in writing that is really going to stay with that person as they, in other words, I'm overstating my case to say it's the only way. But as I invite a reader into experience, which they might experience in the wrong way or not the way I'm thinking about it, that's the only way to through a story to convey what I hope to convey. It's just sort of the catch-22 of being a writer.
Yeah, exactly. When I'm teaching writing, one of the things I want to tell those in my classes is don't overwrite or don't overstate, or don't it might even be best to say don't over-explain. Trust your reader. Trust your reader to be able to work through the metaphor, work through the imagery, or even just listen to the story itself without explaining what the story means. Most of the Bible works that way. Most of the Bible is narrative, and it's rarely explained to us by the authors of the Bible.
Right.
The authors of the Bible rarely
what's that?
I was going to say the authors of the Bible rarely stop and explain what the narrative of this particular story of Abraham or Moses or David means. They tell you the story.
But think how much time preachers spend in those parts of the Bible where it does explain, right? I mean, where you've got, we love Paul.
Yeah.
Thankfully, here's somebody who's going to, speak in some, give me some propositions I can think about instead of stories that I've got to wallow around in and hope for the best.
I think a lot, and I often recommend, and I would guess you have too, Madeline L'Engle's Walking in Water, and her memoir, which is very, very much about writing. She also talks about trusting the story. And her metaphor actually is that writing and trusting your story is like that sort of active faith of stepping out into the water, of walking on water, hence the title of the book. That you're trusting the truth in the story to go where it needs to go without you controlling it, and thereby also trying to control your readers.
Yeah, that is absolutely an act of faith. Okay. We're running out of time, but I do want to hear you talk a little. I'm really interested in this fact that you are a computer science professor and a creative writing teacher and a teacher of literature. How do those two sides of your work inform one another?
There's certainly creativity in both of those. Is not clear to me whether they, in some sense, inform each other. There is a structure or in creativity, like a narrative has a story has a structure. It's creative, and there's a lot of freedom in where that goes, and a lot of freedom in writing. But it does have a narrative structure and a narrative logic. My area of computer science is generally been dealing with spatial and geometric problems. And it's interesting that when I'm writing something creative, whether it's a narrative nonfiction essay or a story, I do often enter into it with that sort of spatial sense. Like I can picture almost the narrative flow. I can see things like that, which I think helps me as a writer. But it was really, for me, not so much these two things coming together as I guess, a passion to things that I cared about. I did graduate work at Cornell University in both computer science and Old English language and literature. And the job prospects were somewhat better in computer science in the mid 1980s than they were in literature, especially for someone interested in medieval literature. So I ended up getting the PhD in computer science, but sitting on my dissertation committee was an English professor who really had no idea what my dissertation was about, but he was simultaneously advising me in translating some Old English language literature, reading medieval archaeology, medieval history, and writing my first novel that got published about 2 years after my PhD in computer science. All my graduate work in English resulted in a couple novels being published as well.
Right. Well, all right. That kind of was my question. Are these two things complementary, or are they just two things that you do?
I think there's a sense in which they're complementary, but I also think that it would be so hard to unravel how they interact, how they impact one another. I mean, it's a little bit maybe like the work that would unravel how did Tolkien and C.S. Lewis's friendship impact each other's writing. I think there's no doubt that it did, but the answer of how and exactly where would not be a simplistic one.
Yeah. All right. Last question, Matthew. Who are the writers who make you want to write?
You know, there are several writers that are, or late writers who were in the Chrysostom Society, whose works I really admire, and who as people, really have inspired me. It's not just their books, but it's them as people. You know, I would certainly aspire to writing something of the beauty and profundity of the Book of the Dun Cow, or the Book of Sorrows. I love, as a narrative nonfiction writer, I would aspire to the works of to the essays of Wendell Berry. Yeah. I think Wendell Berry is a very beautiful, thoughtful writer, and at his best, when he's least didactic, is in some sense when he's most profound.
Yeah, sure.
When he is a poet, when his essays are coming out of that poetic spirit that he has as a poet. Certainly Tolkien, and I'm not sure I would say Norman MacLean, because it's really just one work of his, but I think A River Runs Through It is such a beautiful, fine piece of literature that if I could write one novella like A River Runs Through It, I would have felt like I had invested my life very well. Eugene Peterson, I guess, the late Eugene Peterson, is also one whose spiritual theology is, I find, so beautifully written and also so moving and so insightful that if I were to really invest the next 15 years or 20 years or lifetime in spiritual theology, he would be the one I think I'd be most inspired as a writer to emulate.
His work makes me want to go make something.
He takes creativity so seriously and takes art so seriously, and it so deeply informs how he communicates theology and spirituality.
Well, Matthew Dickerson, thank you so much. I hope a lot of people read this book and discover new depths in Walt Wangerin thanks to this work that you and your friends have done.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the conversation. Right. We should sit down sometime when we don't have to be recorded and just have a cup of coffee and follow several more of these threads that we didn't get a chance to follow up on.
That sounds like fun.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate. Special thanks as well to Taylor Linhart for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for Season 3 of the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorlinhart.com.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.